In the middle of the 18th century, perhaps 200,000 white persons in the continental colonies lived in neighborhoods where Negroes outnumbered them. And the population of the colonies, which later became the United States, taken as a whole, contained a higher proportion of Negroes in the period 1730 to 1765 than at any other time in the nation's history. In many areas, one of the major daily concerns of responsible men was the effective control of masses of slaves.
You better believe that the control over these slaves was a major daily concern. We're reading from the book White Over Black by Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan, and this control over all these slaves had to be considered carefully in order to make this work. And so the English colonizers, these guys, they were masters of control, right? So this task was a very fitting task for their character, and they, of course, would figure out a way to do anything necessary to make it work.
As slavery rapidly entrenched itself in the plantation colonies during the early years of the 18th century, it forced the colonists to come to grips with novel problems which arose from the very nature of the institution. Plainly, Negro slaves were property in a sense not thoroughly comprehended by traditional English concepts and legal categories of bondage and servitude. Sometimes this novelty produced legal confusion.
Black people were property, which was different from the bondage and the servitude that existed back in England at one time, right? And so this was a newly developed idea by the English, right? Turning people into property. And so the legality of this new idea is what they would attempt to make clear and to make appropriate.
Representative assemblies in America and colonial officials in England were trying to stuff a new kind of property into old legal pigeonholes and were frequently unable to achieve a very good fit. In various colonies, slaves were variously declared to be real or personal chattel property.
They were viewed as actual property, right? Just like a piece of furniture or a piece of land is someone's property. It was agreed upon by other humans that the slaves would be placed in this same category, right? Meaning in the world of imagination, people envisioned the idea of Negro slaves being property, right? And then they got other people to see this same vision in their imagination. And then once they said, yes, we like this idea, then they began the process of making it a reality on the physical plane of existence, right? And in this process, there were legal issues that needed to be resolved.
Could a slave owner will or deed Negroes not yet conceived, property which did not yet exist?
People create wills to transfer ownerships of rights to others after their death. And so the question surrounded the possibility of transferring the rights of the Negro offspring who were not yet born at that time, right? Because we have to remember that the black people, they were created to be perpetual slaves in America, meaning that all the slaves' offspring that are identified as black, they were supposed to be servants to the white masters, right? And this is why the question of deeding the unborn children was an important legal question.
Should slaves be taxed by head or by value? These were vexing, if not crucial, problems.
These questions were just as important for the slave owners back then as legal questions are today for people who own real estate properties, right? It was their source of wealth, and they wanted to know how to legally go about approaching it.
Chattel slavery required, in common with other manifestations of the commercialization of society, decisions as to how the account books were to be kept.
It was a business, and anyone who has ran a business or worked in a finance department understands the importance of keeping the books, right? And so did these people.
Considered as men, slaves raised much more difficult problems. The most pressing necessity was maintenance of discipline, hence the famous slave codes.
Now we get into the disciplinary portion of the slave business, right? How to keep the slaves doing only what they're supposed to do and nothing else, right? This was obviously a major concern, just like it's a concern for upper level management in companies today, right? How to keep people on the right track that they want to keep people on, right? And in the days of chattel slavery, physical punishment was one of those disciplinary ways that they used to maintain order.
Except on occasions of panic, the punishments prescribed for Negro offenders in the North were considerably lighter than in the southern colonies, where the traditional 39 lashes, a number derived from Hebraic law, was the usual rule but by no means the limit of chastisement.
Tying people to a post, stripping them of their clothing, and then lashing them with that animal skin whip while all the rest of the other slaves stood there and watched. And so the southern colonies, they gave out 39 lashes, right? Which they got from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3 in the Bible, where their man-made legal code allowed for up to 40 lashes, right? And so the authors of the Bible, they were colonizers in their thinking too. And this is one of the reasons why the European colonizers loved the Bible so much.
This unharnessed personal power was exemplified in the slave codes of the southern colonies, codes which varied in detail from one colony to another but displayed underlying similarities. Slaves were forbidden to wander off their plantation without a ticket from their master or overseer.
They needed permission to do a simple thing such as going off the plantation, and what this instilled in them was a sense of dependency on the whites.
They were never to be allowed to congregate in large numbers, carry clubs or arms, or strike a white person.
No huddling together in large groups because they didn't want them plotting or planning on escaping or doing any violent attacks. No carrying weapons because obviously they didn't want those weapons to end up being eventually used on them, right? And no striking of the white people because they were establishing the system of white supremacy, right? And they wanted those blacks to unconsciously see the whites as being a superior being and to see themselves as being an inferior being, right? And all those tactics, they had lasting psychological damage to the descendants of those slaves all the way up until today, right? And it's going to keep going even further into the future because most of them, they have inherited a worldview and they show little, if any, signs of making any improvements.
Masters were given immunity from legal prosecution should their slave die under moderate correction,
allowing them to legally get away with murder.
All white persons were authorized to apprehend any Negro unable to give a satisfactory account of himself.
If they were to ask a black person who was their owner or what plantation they belonged to or what they were doing and they didn't like the answer that they gave, then that white person could detain that black person, right? And what this is doing is helping to condition the white person to feel like they're always above the slaves, right? And this could have been the poorest and the most uneducated white person, but they would still get high off of the feeling like there was always someone that was beneath them, right? And this is one of the reasons why they gave this privilege out to all the white people in the colonies.
In areas of heavy slave concentration, white men were required to serve in the slave patrols, which were supposed to protect the community, especially at night and on Sundays. Though except in periods of special alarm, the patrols were probably far more impressive on paper than in actuality.
In heavy slave concentrated areas, they would set up the patrols of white men to keep the order. And what did the Negro grow accustomed to seeing? White people in charge and Negroes as the subordinates. And what did most Negroes pass on to their descendants? The same vision.
In addition, slaves committing felonies were tried in specially constituted courts, which typically consisted of a justice of the peace and 2 other slave owners.
Which means that it was stacked against the Negro and they were most certainly not going to receive a fair trial.
Official punishments ranged from a specific number of stripes, well laid on, all the way to burning at the stake, often but not always after strangulation. A punishment not restricted to the southern colonies or to Negroes and not entirely abandoned for Negroes until the 19th century.
And there you have it. That's how the colonizers were able to keep mass amounts of Negroes in order, right? It was a physical, a legal, and a psychological war that ensured the Negroes' position in the pit, where the light is dim and the way to escape is largely unknown, right? And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael. And I'll see you in the free world.